Hi, thank you for joining us today. I am Viviana Weeks Shackelford, and I am here with the Wellness Warriors to talk with you about evolutionary psychology and its possible applications to mental health issues. I am an evolutionary psychologist, and I received my PhD in 2011 in evolutionary developmental psychology. I am currently a faculty member in the Department of Psychology here at Oakland University. I also am the co-director of the Evolutionary Psychology Lab. And in that lab, we, along with Dr. Todd Shackelford, we work with graduate students and advanced undergraduate students who are interested in learning about the research aspect of a psychology degree. I am also the outreach coordinator for the Center for Evolutionary Psychological Science, and I will tell you a little bit more about that center in just a few minutes. Um, my research interests are quite vast. I enjoy research and I enjoy thinking a lot about, especially about evolutionary psychology and its applications. And, um, I'm of course biased, but I am just, fascinated and intrigued and blown away by, the complexity of our brains and how it affects and how it's related to the behaviors that we engage in and the behaviors that we see all around us. So, with that, I am going to switch gears and share some slides and some information with you. So, just bear with me for just a second so that I can do that. Okay, got that ready. Okay, so as I mentioned, I will be talking to you about evolutionary psychology today. I am, of course, a faculty member here at Oakland University and representing today the Center for Evolutionary Psychological Science. And of course, this is my pleasure to be here today with the Wellness Warriors and engaging in this important project. And I must give a shout out to the Wellness Warriors. I'm sure they don't hear it enough, but I thank you for all of the things that you are seeking to do with this group. And it's an act of, care, community, and I would argue, consensus in the sense that you guys are acknowledging that, the more we know, it's possible, that might be a little bit better in moving that progress line forward. Okay, so before I go into the nuts and bolts of the presentation, I would like to just share with you a little bit about our Center for Evolutionary Psychological Science. This is a relatively new development. It was approved in 2020. It's housed in the College of Arts and Sciences here at Oakland University, and the founding director is Dr. Todd Shackelford, who is also a distinguished professor and chair here in psychology at Oakland University. Some of the goals and underlying mission of the evolutionary psychological science and the center more specifically is to promote and support evolutionary psychological research, to also recruit evolutionary psychologists and scientists, and I would say, good scientists, not just evolutionary, but also to facilitate collaborative research projects to fund evolutionary focused research programs, whether it's by graduate students or undergraduate students. And one of the other areas that I'm most excited about for the center is to provide opportunities for community engagement, to share in professional development and also to encourage student success. So part of our goal is to reach out, of course, locally, nationally, and internationally. We have quite a list of external faculty members and academics and clinicians that are on the advisory board for this center. So we are pleased with that. We also intend to provide educational opportunities for the community and for whoever is interested, really, like seminars, summer camps, and certificate programs. We also aim to fund innovative research projects and to organize and host different events by evolutionarily informed psychologists, and including things like interdisciplinary conferences. So I'm going to start here by highlighting a quote from a book that I read this past summer, and it's called The Constitution of Knowledge, Defense of Truth. And the quote is, acquiring knowledge is a conversation, not a destination. And so that quote, it really resonated with me because, and of course, I didn't realize how, my take on this, which is, you know, obtaining knowledge and sharing knowledge. It's something that we do, right? And the knowledge that we obtain and build, it becomes part of, our knowledge base, right? As a whole, as a society, as a group. And the other thing that I wanted to share with you is my philosophy, because I think the philosophy of teaching and sharing knowledge and having a discussion about sometimes difficult topics, and that is, sharing what I know, right? Of course, I don't have all of the answers. I don't know everything, but sharing what I know, using the tools that I have, sharing that with you, learning what you know. Where are you? Trying to meet you somewhere in between, or so that we can be on the same page, so that we can have discussions and make progress in our understanding and our knowledge base. So also asking questions myself. I have tons of questions usually by the end of the day. Even though I spend most of the day trying to find answers, I wind up with more questions, but that's okay. And so that collectively we add to our knowledge base, right? We have in society, in our social rules, there are so many rules that we adhere to that we aren't really aware of, right? And just to keep things in place, cooperating and just keeping, our being able to get through the day, right? You'll notice here at the bottom of this slide a few words like evidence, science, culture, facts, experience, society, reality. And as I was creating this slide, it just occurred to me, what are some words that might capture, part of what I am including in this presentation, and what are important words that kind of capture some of the important things that I think are relevant to, this discussion. So hopefully that'll make sense to you. So I'm going to jump right into evolutionary psychology. So what do we do as evolutionary psychologists? So you'll see over here on the left part of your screen, the smartphone, right? Um, evolutionary psychologists see the mind being made up of psychological mechanisms. And we use this smartphone analogy. I didn't come up with it, but I do use it because I think it does a wonderful job at, describing the similarities in the way we describe psychological mechanisms. So if we look at, the calendar app was designed to deal with problems that are associated with organization, planning, keeping appointments in line, and so forth, right? And that calendar app is going to do best at calendar things, right? Compared to, let's just say, the Target app, right? The Target app is going to work better at solving problems that are associated with shopping at Target, right? And it's not going to do very well at solving problems associated with your calendar app, right? And so similarly, the Costco app is not going to solve problems associated with the Target app, right? And we understand that these apps were designed specifically to deal with the specific problem that it's fixing, right? Or that it's dealing with. And so evolutionary psychologists think about the mind in a very similar way, but we don't talk about apps. We talk about adaptations instead. So what kind of the crux there is that these adaptations that we are talking about of the mind, right, are a result of the process of evolution by natural selection. We use an evolutionary psychological approach as a theoretical framework to understanding how the mind works. So if you take a look here, we've got these adaptations, right? And you can, think about them in terms of app. I think it's a really good analogy. But so we have maybe perhaps a cheating app where we are very sensitive to cues around us, where individuals might be cheating, whether it's a loved one that is cheating or if someone is cheating in a game. For the most part, I think there's quite a bit of evidence, and I think I don't have to show you the evidence, but most people don't like cheaters, right? And so we are very sensitive to any cues of cheating. And if you think about, again, going back to the smartphone, if you think about cheating and perhaps the mechanism, the adaptation that deals with hunger and, nutrients and so forth, this hunger app is not going to be as helpful in issues that come about from surrounding cheating, right? We don't expect that, and well, there's no reason to expect that would be the case, right? So just like these smartphone apps are specifically designed to deal with problems, right, that they were designed to deal with, so too are the psychological adaptations that we have in our brain that guide a lot of our behavior and thinking on a daily basis. So some other apps or adaptations that we can think about are cooperation. We are very social and socially complex species, and part of our design of the mind is to strategize and maneuver through our social groups. And most of the time, of course, we want to cooperate. And so these, same with disgust, there are mechanisms in place that kind of direct our behaviors to, disgust is a cue that, okay, we might want to, engage in a different route or do something different, right? Also, this little flashy mechanism I like to call love, mechanism of love, where it again deals with problems associated with distributing our love or care or investment in those around us, right? And same thing with morality. And these are just a few of the mechanisms where there's quite a bit of research that supports this idea, but there are certainly quite a bit more. So I have this picture of this lens here because I also think it's a wonderful way to think about evolutionary psychology, that it's sort of a lens that we use to investigate behavior. And it is useful. It's a useful, another analogy to think about and include as you think about some of the things that we'll talk about throughout this presentation. So this next slide here kind of expands a little bit more about these psychological mechanisms of the mind, and this speaks to how they work, right? So evolutionary psychologists focus on typically the ultimate explanations for different types of behaviors. That is often compared to proximate level explanations, which are explanations that that you probably think of, and I think of when we're asked a question like, why do mothers care for their kids? So approximate explanation might be something like, well, we love them, right? But as an evolutionary psychologist, it's a wonderful response and it makes total sense. But we are interested in, it doesn't really tell us much about the evolved psychology involved, right? Another level of explanation that could be used is this developmental explanation where we've, learned that it's important to care for our children. Of course, there are social consequences. There are many, quite a few that I could think of off the top of my head, consequences for not caring for your children, right? So one could argue that, okay, well, we've learned that it's really important and it's an effective tool, right, to help your kids along, right, to care for them. Another level of explanation is the phylogenetic explanation, and this really just, this is caring for young is part of, yes, it's part of an evolutionary history. These are, the kinds of behaviors that mammals engage with. And it could be more complex than that, but that's just one phylogenetic explanation. And where evolutionary psychologists sort of turn to, um, often is this functional or ultimate explanation that kind of gets at the evolutionary history and the context that are involved, right? So an ultimate explanation for why mothers care for their children is because they share genes with their children, right? I know it's not very pretty scenario, but it kind of, it moves us back down the line for a deeper and richer understanding of, what is going on when we talk about care for kids and love for kids, right? Another example that is often used is why a question like, why do we grow calluses? Well, approximate explanation is, well, with lifting weights, right? That's I've been lifting weights or, doing gardening. And so, the resulting consequence is an area of callus is growing there. And so a developmental explanation might be something like, well, this thick skin grows in areas when you do a lot of work. Phylogenetic, this is, um, consequence of just being human, that, any sort of repeated friction causes a callus. But an evolutionary or an ultimate explanation might be something along the lines of, well, there's an evolutionary history that, you know, um, those areas that experience repeated friction, one way to prevent infection or further, damage to the area is to build a callus, right? So it kind of, that functional or ultimate explanation sort of links nicely with survival and reproduction, right? And so that's kind of where evolutionary psychologist principle, um, interests lie. Of course, there are evolutionary developmental psychologists and evolutionary social psychologists, but even with those areas, there is this underlying sort of understanding, or the framework is still there. Their focus of their research might be at a more proximate level, but it doesn't mean that they also are not interested, or yeah, that they're not interested in, or that it's not important to understand the ultimate explanation for different things. So another example of a question might be, why do we feel romantic jealousy? Well, approximate explanation might be something like, um, well, my partner was spending more time, or it appears that my partner was cheating on me. A developmental explanation might be something like, well, when I feel jealousy, it might be a learned thing that if I express some level of jealousy, that means that I care. It's showing my partner that I care. A phylogenetic explanation could be something like, well, this is part of our human, you know, evolutionary history that we engage in, upset, or it sort of, guides our behavior, that it's important to express these kinds of things if we want to maintain a mate. And more of an ultimate explanation for why this is, that is, how can we bring that link? How can we link it with problems that directly, or, an explanation that fits more in line with a direct line to problems associated with survival and reproduction. So in this case, why do we feel romantic jealousy? What might be an ultimate explanation? Well, the ultimate explanation is, well, the goal is to deter, right, or stop any sort of cheating, because if our partner is cheating, that is whether it's investing time, money in another individual, or that those are benefits or investment that you could be receiving, right? Which in turn affects your survival and reproduction, right? And so again, just keep in mind that I'm using these as examples, and these are simplified sorts of ways of thinking about it. But my goal here is just to communicate the some of the details, and just an overarching idea of how evolutionary psychologists approach different areas. And hopefully as we go on in the presentation, some of this will become a little more clear. So another useful way of thinking about how the mechanisms of the mind work is this sort of setup. And this is something that was, I've used for decades myself, but I also think that when I use this, I do get positive feedback that it does make things a little bit easier to understand. So again, with that same example, why do we grow calluses? Well, if we use this sort of paradigm here to understand it, I think it's helpful. So we have that repeated friction, which we would call our input, and then there's this this box here represents decision rules, and that is where the processing, a good chunk of the processing occurs, right? So it's, doing all the proper calculations, if this, then that, if A, then B, and I'm sure it's not that simple, but the point is this is where these calculations occur. And then, what is the output? The output might be like one output of repeated friction to an area could be a callus, right? And then from that output, we know that, different behaviors can be approached, right? So same thing with why do we get jealous? So more of a psychological example here, we might have cues of cheating. That is the input, right? So we have these evolved psychological mechanisms in our minds. We get a cue that, perhaps our partner is cheating. It might be, a subtle cue. It might be an in-your-face type of cue, right? But let's just call them cues of cheating. We have our decision rules right here. So these decision rules are going to take things into consideration, right? Like, is it just a subtle cue? Is this, direct evidence? It's taking in those things, taking those things into consideration. And again, making those if this, then that type of calculations throughout in a much more complicated fashion, I imagine. And the output, right? The goal is to stop cheating, right? And to prevent it, to stop it. And so what that behavior looks like in the end is going to depend on many things, right? Sorry, I jumped ahead. It's going to depend on, what those cues were, the context in which it happened, and then the output is going to vary as well, right? So one output or one response to this might be something like, just a simple phone call, I love you, or it could be, a breakup. It could be, talking with others about your situation. So the point is that it's really not simple, but this is a simple framework to think about how these mechanisms operate. So let's switch gears a little bit and kind of take you back to just a quick snapshot of a historical sense of, where did we get these ideas from? Well, I think most people, when we say evolutionary or evolution, we think Charles Darwin, and that's correct. Charles Darwin he's credited with sort of bring together this idea of evolution by natural selection. We know that evolution just means change over time. So, this is something that's been thought of for, hundreds of years before Darwin, right? How do species come to be? Where are the, how are we different from, other animals and so forth? But Charles Darwin is recognized for his The Origin of Species, and in which he, organized and put together his ideas to describe the process, to describe how evolution happens. And I do have Alfred Russel Wallace up here because he is not often thought of or recognized as a contributing individual to our understanding of evolution by natural selection, but he also, around the same time came up with just independently the same sorts of ideas that Charles Darwin did, but Charles Darwin made it to publication a little bit quicker. But I think it's, I like to include it here. So that is, and as I mentioned, there were, discussions of evolution for, at least 2,500 years prior to Darwin's publication. And with this, organization of his thoughts and explanation for how evolution occurs, it really is the foundation for modern day biology, and it is recognized and used. You know, it is pretty much a fact in biology. And it's not, it's just recently that, recently meaning the last few decades, where the application of evolution by natural selection was applied to, humans. So there are three components that are necessary for natural selection to operate. And the three components are variation, inheritance, and differential reproduction. And so when we talk about, these three components, I've got this figure here that kind of captures, I think, these ideas in a colorful way. So we've got our green beetles and our orange beetles, and what you see here are these crows that are just arbitrarily picking these green, well, it looks like it's arbitrary, maybe they're juicier or meatier, I don't know, but they are choosing these green beetles over the orange beetles, right? And over generations, we have, what happens is, these orange ones are, it appears that, they are surviving more, or the green ones are being eaten a lot more. And with this continuation of the orange beetles being more successful in surviving and reproducing, if it's a heritable component, that is, color, if it's something that's heritable, then it will be passed on to later generations. And so what you see here in this final area is more orange beetles. The crows will either, I don't know, move on to an area that has other green beetles, or they might start eating the orange ones, who knows. The point is that this is sort of an arbitrary thing, right, in terms of color, but what we have are exactly what natural selection needs in order to operate. Variation, right? We have variation in the colors of the beetles. We have an inheritance. It's something that is passed on from the one generation to the next. And then there's differential reproduction. That is that the color, right, of these beetles, it matters. The orange ones tend to survive and also reproduce. So it's a perfect scenario for natural selection to operate. Okay, so we'll move on to sexual selection, which is another aspect of evolution by natural selection. Charles Darwin was perplexed about why the peacock has this wonderful tail, an elaborate, colorful tail, and we don't see something like that in the peahen. This is quite an extreme display, and in the end, what Darwin realized was that this is something that it's an indicator to females of the male's health and immune system, in essence, his genetic quality. And again, I'm loosely using these words. And so the presence of something, so extravagant, according to Charles Darwin, is that, or to the principles of sexual selection, is that one powerful drive for this to happen is female preference, right? It's an indicator to females about, these males, right? And his ability. And there is, evidence, research showing that these peacocks with the most colorful trains, yeah, and colorful plumage and so forth, are actually have more mating opportunities than those peacocks who have less extravagant and less colorful tail. So it's a really interesting thing to think about. I do have some other examples of other birds that you might see. Mallard ducks we see all over, and we can most of the time tell with a lot of bird species which individual is the male and which one is the female. So here we've got these mallard ducks that the males are a lot more colorful than the females. Bluebird, same thing. It's, there is some blue on this female bluebird, but the male bird is a lot more, it's brighter, it looks a little bit bigger. I can't recall which duck this is, duck species, but again, same sort of thing, that it's this, extravagant, display of colors and, features that are just information for females to take into consideration as they explore mating opportunities. Also, we've got the cardinal, who has, this is the male cardinal with a lot brighter red, and the female cardinal who has, of course, a lot less red. But my point here is to highlight the importance and of sexual selection as explored by Charles Darwin and its contribution to understanding, natural selection and evolution generally. So here we've got the modern synthesis, and Gregor Mendel is recognized for his contributions to what we call modern day genetics. And he was around and alive during the time of Charles Darwin, but he was, off in his camp doing his exploration. And, Charles Darwin was off doing his exploration. It wasn't until about the mid 20th century that the two fields were put together, and it was called the modern synthesis. There were also other researchers involved in this as well, but this is again the foundation for a lot of the biological sciences and our understanding of genetics and the progress that we've made. It's been made because of these contributions by these just wonderful researchers and scientists. Okay, so what are some misconceptions? So it's not uncommon that when the terms, evolution and evolution by natural selection are used, there are some misconceptions that come to mind, and I've included two two of them that I think are quite often heard. And so the first one is behavior is genetically determined, right? If evolutionary is true, if we say that our behavior and therefore our psychology is a result of evolution by natural selection, then that means the things that we do and the things that we think are it's genetically determined. And it is a misconception about evolutionary thinking. And I will use the same examples that I've been using on a little bit earlier. So repeated friction and our callus example. In order for a callus to appear, we need to have that repeated friction. So while there may be a genetic, an inherent genetic predisposition or some wiring that is available, once, that's part of our genetic makeup, calluses don't just appear, right? We have to have some sort of input or repeated friction in order for the callus to appear. So the idea that, any, behavior or mechanism of the mind or behaviors that are a result of things in our mind, it just doesn't hold much water. Okay, this is a physiological example, right? But let's move on to a psychological example with jealousy. So if it's evolutionary, that means that the behavior cannot change, and that means that any resulting behavior that is derived from this evolved psychology that we have, it means that it's okay and that it's the status quo, it can't be changed. But let's go on with this example of cheating or jealousy. in order to stop, right, a behavior, or, stop your partner from cheating, or intervene, or learn more about what you think might be happening with your partner, we need to have cues that are put into this process, right? So we don't, if you just, go with that example, we don't, just turn to our partner and say, "You're cheating," right? Without having some sort of cues to trigger that sort of thinking, right? So the idea that, um, well, I'm, you know, here the point is, and I understand that with this example and this misconception, I'll jump right to it. So behavior can't change. So let's just say if we're talking about male violence towards women, right, in relationships. If a male thinks that his partner is cheating, and he, not consciously, or we'll leave that part out, but let's say that he engages in sort of violent or abusive behavior. If it's evolutionary, and we say that it is, and there's evidence to show this, that means that he can't change his behavior. If he thinks she's cheating, then it's okay for him to engage in that sort of violence and abuse. Absolutely, 100%. No, that is not the case. There are, in order for that sort of behavior um, to occur, there has to be some sort of input, right? And so we have cues of cheating, we have our decision rules, and we take things into consideration, right? Not um, that are relevant. So there are social consequences to engaging in abusive behavior, or it could actually hurt the relationship if you accuse your partner of cheating and they are not cheating, right? Um, and so my point here is that it just can't be the case that it doesn't change, right? That it cannot change, because we've got these big brains for a reason. We don't just haphazardly lash out if we have any, just a subtle cue, right? Built into these mechanisms of the mind are other mechanisms of the mind that take into consideration the level of the cue. What are the considerations? What exactly is the context in which this is happening? It's much more complex than, A happens, then B happens, and then C happens. Unfortunately, I think actually if that happened, we might have a better way of, fixing a lot of the problems that we have as a society, but it doesn't happen that way, not even from an evolutionary perspective. So what are some products of evolution? And there are three primary products of evolution, and they are adaptations, byproducts, and noise. So adaptations are, you've already heard me talk about this with the mechanisms of the mind. We think of adaptations as, the analogy are those apps, right? And what are adaptations? What are they for? They are for solving problems or any challenge during our evolutionary history that affected our survival or reproduction. So you can think of the heart as an anatomical or physiological, I guess an anatomical adaptation that circulates blood, right? The primary function, at least as we know it today, for the heart is to circulate blood throughout our body, right? That's what it was designed for, and that's why it works better than your liver for such a purpose, right? Sweat is a physiological adaptation that regulates our body temperature. Sexual arousal is a psychological adaptation that motivates sexual behavior. And so I'm using these words like anatomical, physiological, psychological, as sort of the primary context in which these different examples are used. But certainly sweat, there's also other issues involved with sweat and sexual arousal as well. But it's just to highlight that there, you can have adaptations at physiological level, neurological level, anatomical level, psychological level, etc. And one thing to note is that not all products of natural selection are adaptations, right? So we go on to the byproducts, which byproducts are traits that are associated with adaptations. You can't have a byproduct if we don't have an adaptation, and they're incidentally linked to these adaptations. One thing to note is that, identifying a byproduct is just as important and just as rigorous as identifying adaptations, because it also requires you to identify an adaptation first, right, for which that byproduct might be identified. So the human navel is a wonderful way to talk about this, and the whiteness of bones. The human navel, we know the human navel itself is a byproduct of the adaptation of the umbilical cord, for which mothers and their fetuses enjoy, you know, the interaction of blood and nutrients through that umbilical cord, right? The navel is a byproduct of that. That's evidence of that relationship that you had with your mother. And the byproduct of the navel being a byproduct is it's an incidental aspect of the adaptation of the umbilical cord. The human navel does not contribute to survival or reproduction, does nothing for it, right? Same with the whiteness of bones, right? The color of your bones, as far as we know, are a result of the stuff that makes up the bone, right? It's incidental, and it does not have any sort of independent effects or direct effects to survival and reproduction. Noise, which is the third product that we'll be talking about today, or random effects, these are, just even a step further, right? They cannot solve any sort of adaptive problems and are typically produced by mutations. So noise, unlike a byproduct, is not linked to an adaptive aspect of a trait, right? So we can think back to that human navel example. The random shape of an individual's navel would be noise, right? So we have the umbilical cord as the adaptation. The byproduct would be the navel itself, sort of the scarring. And then the noise of the navel could be described as, the noise would be something like the shape of the navel, right? Here in the US, we talk about innies and outies, at least that's what I'm aware of, but there may be other ways of describing the shape, but it really has nothing to do with the adaptive nature of the umbilical cord. So let's talk about these evolutionary time lags and environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. And this is going to come up a little bit later, so pay attention to these wonderful fries, cheeseburgers, and pizzas. So when we talk about evolutionary psychology, right, we have to think of our minds today as a product of our ancestral history, right? It took millions of years for our brains to evolve, and the stuff that makes up our mind to evolve, right? So what that means is that our brains evolved at a different time, and because it's taken so long, it takes such a very slow and gradual process. Although there's argument about different aspects of that. The modern day environment is quite different than the ancestral environment in which our brains and our psychology evolved. So there is, historical, anthropological, paleontological, evidence that our ancestral past was one in which we operated in small bands of, very closely related individuals. There were times where we did not have access to consistent food or nutrients. And one way to deal with that inconsistency, right, of our availability of foods and nutrients is to eat whenever you can, right? And the fattier, the better. And while that may have worked, clearly it did, because we're here today, it worked during our ancestral environments. Today, these types of foods are at every corner of every intersection, making it very difficult to say no to these types of foods. These are, and so the way we think about this is, that there's this evolutionary mismatch, right? So we've got these ancestral brains but we are living in a modern environment where now there's really no concern for the most part. Of course, I understand that there are nutritional instances where um, people do not have access or don't have the means to have regular nutrition, but we're talking just on average, and the ability to say no to these things is very difficult. Right, and hence we have quite high numbers of obesity and diabetes and clogged arteries and things associated with this mismatch of our ancestral brains in a current modern environment. So what are some domains or areas that evolutionary psychology has played a role in and has informed? This is not an exhaustive list, but these are the most common, or I think, there's a lot of research across the board, but here are some common areas that are informed by evolutionary thinking. So sex differences, why we might expect, sex differences in particular areas between men and women, aggression, mating and romantic relationships, family relationships, cooperation, social conflicts, status hierarchies, and morality. So, in thinking about these different domains here, these are kind of, you can easily relate them to, social sciences and so forth. But other areas have also been informed, and, the just growing in other areas that may not be clearly linked to the social science, but I mean, we could make an argument for drawing these in, but public policy is now being informed by evolutionary thinking. Law is also, being informed, and a lot more, interest in framework application to thinking about the way the laws are created. Also thinking about the sentencing and types of treatment, criminal treatment, differences in the way that women and men are treated, and the way that they are incarcerated and so forth, right? Certainly economics and consumerism, those are areas also that have recently just skyrocketed in the application of evolutionary thinking to these areas. And I have mental health here in green because this is what the focus is today. But I do want to point out that, the application, or just thinking about applying evolutionary thinking to the mental health framework or mental health areas or issues, is nothing new. It's been going on for decades, right? It's just recently I myself have been thinking, and have, grown very interested in understanding where evolutionary psychology is in its application to mental health issues, and can we benefit from it? So I'm going to take you on this little ride with me. So the call for applying an evolutionary framework to mental health issues, like I said, is nothing new. I do have this paper posted here just as an example of, I'm not just making this up. This is something that is actually out there in research, and people are researchers in mental health are also, quite interested, and I think pushing the pedal on the need for a different way of thinking about mental health issues. And so I'm going to just pull out, a sentence or two here that highlights this. So we reviewed several previous applications of evolutionary theory that highlight the ways in which psychiatric conditions may persist despite and because of natural selection. So again, highlighting this idea, and this is just my point here, that, again, this is nothing new that I am saying. So I'm just kind of bringing my thoughts together and sharing this with you. One lesson from the evolutionary approach is that some conditions currently classified as disorders, because they cause distress and impairment, may actually be caused by functioning adaptations operating normally as designed by natural selections. So when we think about disorders of the mind, like, what we call disorders, and I'm using air quotes here, disorders of the mind like depression or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, the proposal that has been consistent from an evolutionary perspective is that these expressions, right, or these constructs that we have defined, we define what depression is. Um, perhaps they are the output of, or they themselves might be, the result of a normal sort of brain functioning, right? So, um, let's see. So the complexity, right? Okay. So thus, the evolutionary approach suggests that psychiatry should sometimes think differently about distress and impairment. The complexity of the human brain, including normal functioning and potential for dysfunctions, has developed over evolutionary time and has been shaped by natural selection. Understanding the evolutionary origins of psychiatric conditions is therefore a crucial component to a complete understanding of its etiology. So again, just highlighting, the point here that, look, I'm not saying anything new. The application and thinking of evolutionary psychology or evolutionary thinking to the framework, and using the framework to think about applying the framework to psychiatry, mental health conditions, psychopathology generally has been ongoing, and there have been a number of theories that have been put forward that have the same sort of approach, right? That what we describe, we meaning what we hear typically, whether it's social media or just, in discussions, if we might actually read these kinds of things in academics as well, that disorders such as depression and, we see them as dysfunctions or there's something wrong. But my understanding at this point of the literature and, evolutionary thinkers is that it might be time to rethink how how we as a society, think about these, again, loosely saying here, disorders. So David Buss, in his textbook that he uses for introductory evolutionary thinking, kind of helped me with this. It kind of organized my thoughts, in putting this together. So the question that I have here is, can evolutionary psychology inform our understanding of mental health? I say yes. I am biased. I understand that. But bear with me here as we work through this. And I'd be curious after the talk for any sort of feedback and, to continue a conversation about this. I don't have the answers, but maybe you do. So I'd love to be enlightened. But so the DSM or the DSM-4 or 5, I forget where they're at this point. When we think about disorders or depression, anxiety, and so forth, we think disorder, dysfunction, abnormal, maladaptive. There's something wrong is the bottom line. But when we apply this evolutionary thinking to, this issue, a few questions can be raised, right? Could it be that mental health disorders, and I'm doing air quotes, you see actual air quotes there, could it be the case that mental health disorders, what we call them, are functioning just as they're supposed to, right? And that the possible explanation for why it appears that it is not, it appears as a mental health disorder is that there's a discrepancy between ancestral and modern environments, right? So one example that I think David Buss uses in his talking about this topic is, which is a wonderful one, postpartum depression, with women, that in our ancestral environments, women, we operated and moved around in bands of close relatives and extended relatives. So we ancestrally we had a tight knit support group, and so forth. One of the hallmarks, of identifying postpartum depression is not having a support system in our modern environment. That's one of the key features or key predictors of postpartum depression. And, so this kind of highlights, or, at least I think is a good example or a good way of thinking about how something like postpartum depression, we call, a dysfunction or abnormal sort of psychological functioning in our modern environment, it's actually working as it's supposed to, right? That women who have more of a support system wind up not having, there's just a lower incidence of postpartum depression, whereas women that have more of a social support system report, less incidence of postpartum depression. So for number two, could it be that mental health disorders are subject to normal errors? So when we think about these adaptations of our mind, right, if we think about the heart, for example, which is a good physiological or anatomical example, the heart works, most of the time as it should. If there are little errors that do occur, we aren't aware of those errors because they're probably just, they don't affect anything else that we're aware of, right? So we're not aware of what's happening. And we understand that these adaptations have to work most of the time. It's never going to be perfect, right? Even the heart is not perfect. Sometimes there's a, electrical malfunction or, it, right. And so it's a natural sort of on average level of operation. Errors will happen, right? And so same is true for, the same could be true for these mental health disorders. It could be just, these are normal functioning adaptations, and sometimes, it's off kilter and it's just an error, but it doesn't mean from there, you're headed down this dark tunnel forever. Three, could it be the case that these mental health disorders, or what we call mental health disorders, are a result of individual differences in subjective interpretation? So, the example that I like to use is, if we have, three individuals that have exactly the same car accident and they total their car, no injuries, thank goodness. But the car is totaled, right? You can have one individual that goes into a depression. What am I going to do? This changes everything. It's global sort of, oh my, right? And then you can have another person who says that, well, that's okay. I'll ride my bike. I got a bike. It doesn't matter, right? And then you might also have someone who has, that does also, get upset. There's a response like, well, there's no car. Thank goodness no one was hurt. I'm going to contact my insurance company and we'll go from here. We'll get it all fixed, right? So all three of these individuals are experiencing exactly the same situation, right? The upset or, a life incident. What, the description of depression is sort of a result of that individual's subjective interpretation of what has happened, right? So it doesn't mean that given a car accident, someone will be depressed, or, there's a level of subjectivity to things that happen, is the point here. And the fourth question that could be asked is, could it be the case that these mental health disorders are called as such because they lead to social harm? So there are, the example that David Buss uses in his book is one of psychopathic behavior. Typically, we don't like that. We call that a bad thing, right? Psychopathic behavior, because we understand that, that can harm us, right? Generally speaking, on average, psychopathic individuals cause harm, but we are sort of defining what that means, right? We're sort of not, it's not really getting at understanding, the mechanisms of that, what we're calling a disorder. There are instances in which psychopathic behavior might be, and I'm not condoning any sort of violent behavior whatsoever, or psychopathic behavior generally, but we're just sticking to, explanations, and, the exploration of these mechanisms have to go a little bit deeper. And sometimes you might have to ask difficult questions like, are there some times where psychopathic behavior might be relevant or useful, right? In what context might we expect that to occur, right? So my point here with that fourth one is that there are, we as a society are defining and calling different types of disorders bad or harmful or maladaptive or, disordered or dysfunction, um, without, and the argument is that we are not really getting at the root of the mechanisms that are involved here. So I'm going to switch gears again to build, sort of an argument for why it is time, I think, for a new look at, thinking about mental health issues. So this represents, what you're seeing here represents a pattern of symptom overlap in the DSM-4. So here we've got these various dots that represent each of the symptoms that are listed here: mood disorders, anxiety disorders. I'm not going to read through every single one of them, but sleep disorders, personality disorders, disorders first diagnosed in infancy, childhood, and adolescence. Let me do, how about another one? Substance-related disorders, schizophrenia, and so forth. So there's quite a bit of, disorders or, listed here, right? But what I'd like to bring your attention to is the pink dots, the orange dots, and the green dots, which represent mood disorders, anxiety, and substance abuse. And the message here that I'm trying to convey is that, we see these dots, right, and they represent where they fall within the DSM-4 in which chapters, right? And so what I want to bring your attention to is these mood disorders, anxiety, right, that we see around here, and then these green substance abuse disorders, right? So these are all diagnoses in the DSM-4. And what we see here is how they are clustered together and are also connected to each other, right? And so the point here is that when we talk about depression or anxiety or mood disorders, it's very rare that these symptoms, right, or symptoms of these disorders, or we call disorders, are operating alone, right? We often hear that a lot of these disorders are comorbid, right, with a long list of other, well, not necessarily a long list, but are often accompanied by other diagnoses, right, or other symptoms that would lead to other, other diagnoses, right? So the point is that this is much more complex than, labeling an individual with depression, because depression, at least based on the symptoms that are associated with depression, could also be linked with anxiety or substance abuse disorders as well. So this captures sort of the complex nature of symptomology in the DSM. Okay, so in this slide here, what I'm showing you is the percentage of people in the US who suffered from depression from 1990 to 2019. This is taken from Statista, who they create statistics using data from a wide variety of national level survey collections, so like the CDC, NIH, and so forth. So this is their figure that I pulled, and it's publicly accessible, so you can take a look at it yourself and read more about it if you would like. But my goal with this slide is to show how common it is and how common it has been since 1990. So this goes 1990, you'll see that right here, through 2019. And my take on this is that while there may be differences, we can look from year to year, maybe some subtle differences, as a whole, it's a relatively stable, label of depression, right? A stable phenomena that we that we see here, right? So it ranges from, I think the lowest is 4.7 to actually the highest is 4.93% of people reported being suffered from depression from 1990 to 2019. So it's a relatively stable feature, and it's not unique to the US. This is something that has been documented, um, across the world. The World Health Organization also has quite a bit of data that is also publicly available, that you can, make that comparison and see for yourself. This is, I don't have it included here, not because it's not available or that it says something different. It's just I don't have it here. But you're welcome to explore that. And this is my take, that it's, we saw in the previous slide that it's complex. We also see that it's a common, at least this is my take, that it is common, and that we can also see this across cultures. So here is changes in mental stress among adults in the US from April 2020 to January 2021 by month. And so these individuals were asked about their, how stress has changed over the last month. And what we see from April 20th to January 2021 is very similar pattern of findings, right? This is also from Statista, same spiel there, that it's it's their statistics using publicly available data. And what we see here, April 2020, we all know that COVID was a big part of our lives at that point. And so asking about the previous month, these individuals reported, or, these participants reported, a 49%, changes in mental stress, 35% here. And then we see sort of a tapering off or a leveling out of stress levels, right? And so the idea here is speaking to, stress, higher stress means higher, rates of depression. And so we see this leveling out, right? With more mental stress kind of remaining stable. In this next slide, we have percentages of respondents in the US who reported symptoms of depressive disorder in the last 7 days or 2 weeks. And again, we see the same pattern that we saw in that first, from 1990 to 2019, and participants reporting being depressed. The same sort of pattern, right? Where in the 2020, we have this higher rates of depression in the last 7 days to 2 weeks. And then as COVID, became, I guess, a little more normal part of our lives, we see a little bit of a tapering off. We do see a little peak here, and, one could take a look and see, what was going on during this time that, might explain this peak. But if we, envision, a figure like this, kind of taking a step back and spreading it out a little bit further over the years, we might see that same sort of, pattern where, yes, there are blips, increases and decreases, but probably if we looked a little bit deeper into those peaks and valleys, that there may be something going on socially that could explain why that's happening, right? But then we still come back to this tapering or tamping down, or, like a settling of this depressive symptoms. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about suicide, because often, the talk goes from, about mental health disorders. We talk about, well, we have to prevent depression because depression leads to suicidal ideation. Suicidal ideation results in suicide, right? And I think in the next 2 slides, I'll tell you why that might not be the case. But what I'd like to show here is just one thing that's been consistent across studies, and just a general trend, since suicide has been documented, is this relative difference between males and females, that males on average deliberately kill themselves at a much higher rate, or maybe not much higher, but a consistently higher rate than females, right? And this is just kind of speaking to that. That's something that's relatively stable across time and across cultures. There are, again, when we do see deviations, there is probably, something that is happening during that time around that, population that could explain why there's the deviation. But this is what we typically find. So we've got males here, and I do have to point out that, they look similar, but if you look here on this y-axis, these the suicides per 100,000 individuals in a population, these numbers are quite a bit higher compared to the numbers on the female y-axis, right? So we see 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, whereas so with the highest rates being at, oops, I'm sorry about that, with the highest rates being somewhere around maybe 42 or 43 suicides per 100,000, in the population. But for females, the highest rate is somewhere around 10, 10 individuals per 100,000 in the population. So, of course, for any instance of, where an individual deliberately kills themselves, it's an awful, awful thing. But, so any one is devastating, right? But we do have to speak about differences. We do have to speak about differences and talk about, what is different in their psychologies that might help us with understanding why it happens, how it happens, and so forth. So we see here that there are, so the blue lines for both of these figures are those that are 10 to 14. The black lines for both of these are 15 to 24, 25 to 54 are the gray lines. The red line is those individuals 45 to 64, green 65 to 74, and yellow 75 and over. So we see, there are some differences. So like if we take our yellow line, which are the 75-year-old individuals and older, we see that they are actually have higher rates of suicide, the highest rates of suicide compared to the other age groups with males. And for females, the highest rates are being or of individuals deliberately taking their lives are those individuals that are 45 to 64 years old. Okay, so there are some differences. Sometimes I think, when we hear about suicide in the media, social media, and, we don't often hear the nuances, and these are important nuances, especially if we want to understand why this happens, how it happens, and so forth. We have to understand these nuances. It cannot be dismissed or ignored. The other, I thought this was a really interesting slide to include because it speaks to our moral interpretation of suicide. And if you look here, these are individuals reporting or answering the question, do you consider suicide morally acceptable or morally wrong? So morally acceptable is represented here in the blue section of these bars. And the dark blue represent those who answered that it's morally wrong. And then the gray at the top here of these bars are those who said that it's not a moral issue. So what I think is really interesting here and telling is that, well, there's clearly a larger percentage of individuals report that suicide is morally wrong. And again, without being an expert on this question and morality specifically, if it's something that's morally wrong or morally not acceptable, then it's probably something that we don't want to talk about. So we often talk about the negative stigma surrounding suicide. And one reason for why it might be a negative, that we have this continued negative stigma is, it plays into, it's, I would argue that it's related to our moral assessment of suicide, right? And so, for those who are interested in reducing that stigma and, would like to address it and try to, change that, right? I think, continuing to do what you're doing and talking about these things might be useful. But this might also explain why there's this negative stigma, and it's really difficult to sort of break. This might be standing in our way. Okay, so evolutionary psychology, what does this mean? And where is the future of evolutionary psychology as it relates to mental health issues? The impact of evolutionary psychology on just general psychology has been just huge. For decades now, the field has been just growing exponentially. The not just evolutionary psychology, but it's the framework that it uses to understand human behavior is just, it's being applied in many disciplines and subdisciplines, including medicine and law, right? Now, Cass Sober is someone who I've recently begun exploring his writing and his thinking. He is a evolutionary psychologist and also a clinician. And Cass Sober, he has a different way. He's sort of put out a different way of thinking about, using an evolutionary framework to understand psychopathology and suicide specifically. As I mentioned earlier, there are many theories or hypotheses that have been put forward that are informed by an evolutionary perspective to explain why there are mental health issues and, things like depression and anxiety and bipolar disorder and so forth. What Cass Sober does is he proposes that psychopathology is an effort to thwart self-induced lethal outcomes. Okay, so and he uses this pain brain idea, which, he says that it's unique to humans, right? The idea that, at least there's no evidence so far, good evidence so far, that other species, non-humans, experience and are able to think about, ending that pain forever, right? This is something that humans uniquely have. And when we think about pain, right, if you bump your knee or you're having, just abdominal pain, what is pain for? Pain is used to motivate, some sort of behavior to minimize or address that pain. Where's it coming from? Where exactly does it hurt? What caused it? Right? We want it to stop that pain. And in Cass Sober's model of thinking, this pain brain model, the brain, right? If you're having a what he refers to as psych ache, and this is a term that's been used in psychology and understanding mental health issues for some time, but he describes this pain as, also it's a psych ache, right? We having psychological pain, and oftentimes it's linked to social issues, right? It's a result of social consequences or things that are happening in an individual's life, right? So the psych ache or pain of your psychological pain, it's subject and triggers those same sorts of things that are triggered when you bump your knee or you have abdominal pain. You want it to stop, right? You want it to stop. We need to fix this. And what Sober proposes is that we have our brains, right, they must be developmentally ready, or there must be this cognitive capacity or a cognitive threshold that has to be reached in order for the brain to affect responses. So we don't see children typically, on average, suffering from psychological pain, right, or psych pain, psych aches in the way that adolescents or young adults or even older adults experience, right? And his argument is that they do not have the cognitive capacity to to understand that, one response is to, deliberately end one's life. Of course, we understand that there are instances in which this happens, right, where that happens, but we don't. It's very far and few between where it happens, and each one, of course, is obviously devastating. But so things like depression, anxiety, mood disorders are manifestations of what Cassoper says they are anti-suicide defenses, right? So if you think about depression, it sort of tamps down your ability to coordinate, to think about exacting any sort of permanent, damage to oneself. Anxiety is often invokes, confusion and also, this sort of panic and, lack of clarity. And right. So again, sort of, the attempt is to slow down this process, right? Same with mood disorders, that they are all manifestations of anti-suicide defenses. So one thing that you sort of have to let go of is this idea that depression causes suicidal ideation causes suicide. According to Cassoper and my understanding of the literature at this point as well, is that there is, yes, those things are related. There is a correlation between depression and suicidal ideation, and depression and suicide risk. But what Cassoper is saying is that it's not the causal, that arrow is not a causal. We don't know the direction of, we can't say for certain that it's depression that's causing suicidal ideation or suicide. There's no evidence to suggest that. And one of the things that he indicates is that the majority of individuals with serious mental health disorders, and I'm doing it in air quotes as well, do not take their own lives. So people with severe, even most people who suffer traumatic life events, right, as devastating as they could be for one individual, or another, the typical response, it's atypical for someone to deliberately end one's life, even in the face of horrible life trauma, right? And consistent with this idea, and it's not something that is promoted or talked about in social media or in everyday conversations, is that there's an acknowledgement of this, even at the clinic, at a clinician's level, that there's an early increase in suicide risk as depressive symptoms begin to lift. This is an awareness and an alert that practitioners and clinicians are aware of, that once this depression lifts, right? And if you think about this, if you go with me here, that depression lifts and you have, sudden energy and, I got this. That's when clinicians are particularly attuned and understand that there is elevated risk for, for suicide risk at that point, when the depression has lifted, not during depression, right? And so what, in a nutshell, what Cassoper is, suggesting here is that we have these evolved protective interventions, right? Like depression, like anxiety, that are sort of normal protective manifestations of our evolved psychology, right? That they are interventions, and what we call them, or what they appear as, is psychiatric disorders. We are calling them psychiatric disorders. And so I know it's a lot right there packed in one slide, but just to kind of, take it away from evolutionary thinking for just a second. And again, this is my thinking about this, that there is this implicit acknowledgement of problems that the area of mental health has in understanding mental health issues, that we're sort of stuck in, labeling. And again, this is something that's really important, and that I understand, especially as a researcher and scientist, that we do the best we can given the evidence that we have, right? But one of the things that is a good feature, and we know is a good feature of a theoretical approach, is if it generates new ways of thinking and new questions that can be asked about these same old things, right? And I really think that this is you know an extension, a great example of a good theoretical framework, because it is generating new ways of thinking and new questions, um, about this topic. So the National Institute of Health, they have this new initiative called the Research Domain Criteria. And, I would go as far as to argue that in this framework, this initiative, they're sort of admitting that, look, we might have to go beyond the label of depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, as describing, the state of individuals' psychic or psych, psychic, right? So the RDOC framework provides an organizational structure for research that considers mental health and psychopathology in the context of major domains of basic human neurobehavioral functioning rather than within established diagnostic categories. The framework currently includes 6 major functional domains. And my point with this slide here and this figure from the National Institute of Health here is that there is an acknowledgement here that this is my read, that it's probably time to move on beyond the label. It's not, if we expect to reduce these symptoms and to address them in a better way, then we might have to rethink the way we are approaching these symptoms, right, or these labels that we are using, right? So in this framework, they're suggesting to take into consideration lifespan development, units of analysis. Are we looking at the genes? There's these depressive disorders and anxiety. These are very heritable traits. Again, suggesting that it's part of our human nature, right? It doesn't mean that we have to just let it go and accept it as it is, right? We can want to make people feel better, but in order to make people feel better, one approach might be, well, maybe we should understand it a little bit better. So these are just to lighten the mood a little bit. These are some books that just to highlight, the in book format, the importance of including evolutionary thinking and some examples of evolutionary thinking as it applies to medicine and psychiatry. Randy Nesse is often referred to as, one of the major contributors to this area. Good Reasons for Feeling Bad is his most recent book, Insights from the Frontier of Evolutionary Psychiatry. Defining Mental Disorder by Jerome Wakefield and His Critics. This is just a collection of, a framework that Jerome Wakefield has put forward, and then responses from philosophers, clinicians, and so forth that they sort of put together in a book, which is really fascinating. And then also The Evolution of Life, of a Life Worth Living. This was a book written by Cass Soper, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, which is a phenomenal book. And then these are just some examples of, other evolutionary informed books on psychiatry, religious beliefs, and medicine. So you can take a look at those. These are books that are must reads. If I had to pick a few, here are just a handful of them. If you're interested in learning more about evolutionary psychology, these are wonderful starting places. David Buss, who is one of the founders of the field of evolutionary psychology, he's got a wonderful textbook that is often used. We use it here at Oakland University for at an introductory level to share with students the field and where it is. One of his books, The Evolution of Desire. Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene is a great way to think about and learn about Evolution by Natural Selection. Deborah Lieberman and Carlton Patrick are also, I included this book because it speaks to the evolutionary application of law. The evolutionary application to law, and then the adapted mind. Again, the authors here are Jerome Barkow, Alida Cosmides, and the late John Tooby, who the two of these individuals are also part of the group that we credit for founding the field of evolutionary psychology. And then Adaptation by Natural Selection is also a wonderful book with a lot of insights and details about natural selection and how to identify adaptations and so forth. So I mentioned a minute ago some of these authors or the founders of modern day evolutionary psychology: David Buss, Leda Cosmides, Martin Daly, John Tooby, and Marco Wilson. Thank you. They bought into this quote here by Theo Dobzhansky: "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And thank goodness they did, because this field is contributing a lot to our understanding of human behavior. So what are some of my concluding remarks? Well, the idea of applying evolutionary theory to psychology is not a new one, right? And it's certainly not new to think about in terms of mental health either. But understanding the adaptive problems that our cognitive mechanisms were designed to solve, we can gain more insights, a deeper understanding into why we behave the way we do and why we think the way we do. For example, our ability to recognize and avoid potential threats was likely shaped by natural selection over time, right? If we don't have a spider phobia ourselves, we know someone who does. Or if you don't have a snake phobia, you know someone who does, right? So, if you think about ancestral environments, and I know there are environments maybe not, close to you, but there are environments outside of Western world, and some areas even in the United States, where there might be more risk of a poisonous spider or snake being close by. But for the most part, we don't encounter that very much, yet we still have these mechanisms in mind that direct us to be startled or to have an outright phobia towards these types of poisonous animals, even in our modern environment. So without an evolutionary perspective, psychology can seem like a disjointed collection of unrelated subfields. And I would say that, not seem like, but I think it appears that way, right? Evolutionary approaches allow for a better way of thinking about the complex nature of our human behavior. It's a lens with which we can use to think about, why we are the way we are. And from that, we can reap the benefits of progress, right, by applying this framework to our psychology, including mental health issues and serious social, problems like deliberately killing oneself. So we can reap these benefits of progress just as the biological sciences have for decades now. There is no biology, there's no understanding of biology without evolution by natural selection, understanding how that works, right? So the argument here is that there is no reason, at least no reason that I can think of or that I have seen, that we should not apply evolutionary thinking to understanding and making more progress in understanding our human nature. Ultimately, Darwin's theory of natural selection provides a powerful theoretical framework within which to organize all of psychology, instead of looking at these disjointed collections of understanding. So there's a developmental understanding, a social, a cognitive. Inherent to a evolutionary framework is this idea that it's not just a genetic explanation. We understand that there's this interactive relationship between genes and environment. And by considering ways in which our evolutionary history has shaped our minds and behavior, we can gain a deeper understanding of what makes us human. So I'd like to leave you with a quote. It doesn't seem right to not include this quote if we're talking about evolutionary psychology. This is a quote taken from Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, in the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Light will be thrown on the origin of man. So this was 1859, and here we are, still talking about this, and this quote is totally relevant today. I'm ending the talk with a addition to the quote that I included earlier in the very beginning of the presentation. Acquiring knowledge is a conversation, not a destination, right? Let us meet here again tomorrow was also included as part of this quote in Jonathan Rauch's The Constitution of Knowledge and Defense of Truth. And this was a quote that he used from Aristotle. And I think it captures the way that I think about understanding science and its application, and just knowledge in general, that it's a conversation, not a destination, right? And even for topics as difficult as mental health issues, and we don't, or if we're not depressed or anxious ourselves, we know someone who is, but one of the outcomes, or one of the things that are sort of tied into those discussions, is things like suicide, right? And while I don't have all of the answers, and I don't think anyone does at this point, it's certainly worth a conversation, right? And we don't want that conversation to be the last conversation. It's not something that ends. We can always understand things better. And let us meet here tomorrow. Let us meet here again tomorrow. If you are interested in learning more about any of these topics, please feel free to reach out to me. I will include some contact information for myself, also for the Department of Psychology, and then for the Center for Evolutionary Psychological Sciences. I welcome any feedback, and thank you so much for your time, and I hope that you enjoyed my presentation.